Hello, my name's Becky from So Much More, and this is my garden. Now, we're right in the middle of no-mow May at the moment, and the garden looks like an absolute disaster. It's so untidy, but it's really, really good for our insects. Now, since we're in the middle of no-mow May, I thought I'd share something with you that's just a little bit different. A few weeks ago, I recorded a conversation with one of my absolute heroes, Professor Dave Goulson. I recorded the conversation for my podcast, The Seed Pod, but I wanted to share it with you guys as well because it's really, really interesting. Now, Dave and I chatted about climate change and the effect that climate change could have on our garden, and particularly with respect to bumblebees and other insects, which is Dave's absolute bread and butter, and he is really, really passionate about this subject as well. I really hope that you enjoy listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. Dave has been such an inspiration for me for so many years. It was a real pleasure to get to talk to him. And in case you can't notice from the recording, I am slightly nervous about talking to him, but he's so kind and so generous with his time. It was a real joy. So enjoy the conversation. So, Dave, a lot of your work that you do is around insects, and you're the founder of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust as well, and you are, I'm gonna say, probably the top expert on bumblebees in the world.
Maybe.
At least very interested in bumblebees.
Yeah, definitely that.
And why not? Because they are absolutely lovely, aren't they?
Yeah, I love them.
Could you tell us a little bit in your words, because it's going to be far better coming from you than coming from me, what it is that you do?
So I'm a Professor of Biology at the University of Sussex, and for about 30 years I've been studying mainly bumblebees, trying to understand more about their ecology, their behaviour. They're just really fascinating and really important little creatures through the pollination that they do. And I'm really these days focused on trying to understand their declines and what we can do to turn them around. And I guess I've just always broadly been interested in insects ever since I was a little kid. And I don't know why, just one of those things that some people like trains or astronauts or dinosaurs. I just always loved bugs, and I've been really lucky to make a career out of chasing around after them.
That's so fantastic. I mean, I've always been interested in bugs myself, but you describe yourself as being slightly eccentric with your love of bugs. But for me, I was just weird with my collection of beetles in my bedroom and things like that. It was not viewed as eccentric when I was young.
I do think a lot of kids have that bug phase though, and it's really sad that so many grow out of it, and by the time they're older, teenagers, adults, they're frightened of bugs. They flap around and try and squash them if anything buzzes near them, which is really sad.
It is.
Yeah. So
a lot of your recent book, Silent Earth. Now, Silent Earth was kind of almost a review, a nowadays review based loosely on Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And Silent Spring was obviously written right back in the 60s.
60 years ago, almost exactly.
Yeah. So, and Silent Earth kind of revisits a lot of those things. And really, I think Rachel Carson would be rolling in her grave if she knew how bad it had gotten since then. But whilst Silent Spring concentrates a lot on pesticides and DDT and things like that, Silent Earth has another undertone to it, and almost a scarier undertone, and that is climate change. Can you tell us a little bit about how Silent Spring looks at climate change and how you've noticed climate change making a difference in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, insects do face many problems. Rachel was very focused, as you say, on the impact pesticides were having on them. Unfortunately, that problem hasn't gone away by any means. Insects are still, we expose them to dozens of different pesticides, many more than were used in Rachel Carson's day. But unfortunately, they're also suffering from a whole bunch of other problems. Habitat loss has continued since Rachel Carson's day. There are issues with light pollution at night, fertilizers which affect water quality in rivers and streams, cause algal blooms which wipe out insect populations. But then on top of all of that, we now have climate change, which of course wasn't recognised 60 years ago. You know, that was something nobody was talking about, and I fear will be the final straw for many insects. You know, because their populations are much reduced by all these other factors, and now they're having to cope with basically their climate fundamentally changing, which is they could perhaps respond to by shifting northwards, or you know, to cooler climes, obviously be shifting southwards in the southern hemisphere, but there's not many of them, and the habitat isn't there for them to move to, so I fear it will push many species over the brink, which is really worrying, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very it's terrifying, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's crudely, globally, it's estimated that about one species an hour is currently going extinct. You know, we are already in the 6th mass extinction event caused by mankind. And because something like 2/3 of all known species are insects, then the chances are the species that goes extinct this hour is probably going to be an insect somewhere. Maybe an insect that we haven't even discovered yet, which is kind of almost more poignant somehow. But yeah, there really is a crisis, and we need to wake up.
I mean, when you put it like that, in the time that it will take to listen to this podcast, something will go extinct. It's pretty hideous, isn't it? Now, this is predominantly a gardening podcast, and I think a lot of gardeners don't necessarily link climate change and insects as well with a direct impact on them personally. Now, not just from a gardening perspective, it's going to have an impact on all of us. Can you talk through, perhaps with a little bit of a slant towards gardening, what could happen and what we might see happening over the next couple of decades with climate change continuing on the course that it currently is?
Sure. So, of course, insects are incredibly important. Most people don't really appreciate them, but we need them. Of course, they're pollinators. They ensure that the vegetables we grow, your runner beans, need a bee to come and pollinate them, or else you won't get a bean to eat. And likewise, most fruit and vegetables rely on insect pollinators. But insects are also really important in other ways in the garden. They're involved in keeping the soil healthy, in composting in your compost heap. They're food for pretty birds that you might like to see. They're basically everywhere and involved in every kind of ecological process you can think of. But many of them are threatened by climate change. And I mean, particularly, for example, my speciality, bumblebees. They're big and furry, and they're big and furry for a reason. It's an adaptation to thriving in cool climates. That's a fur coat to keep them warm, and their large size, they generate heat by flapping their flight muscles, and that enables them to fly around in early in the spring now when it's pretty cold outside. But inside, the bumblebee can have a body temperature that's 30 degrees higher than the air temperature, which is amazing. So they're really good at living in cold places. They can live right up in the Alps. There's a species, Bombus polaris, that lives in the Arctic Circle, where hardly any insects can survive. But of course, You can see where I'm going with this. They thrive in cold weather, but they literally overheat in hot weather. That furry coat suddenly becomes a huge disadvantage when there's a heat wave or the climate warms. And so we've seen bumblebees disappearing from the warmer edges, the southern edges of their range in Europe. And there are some really scary predictions people have tried to model. If we reach 2 degrees warming, 2.5 degrees warming, where will European bumblebees be able to live in the future? Where we'll have the right climate for them? And most of our common bumblebees in this country will not be able to live in Britain if it gets that warm. And it seems quite likely that we're going to reach 2.5 degrees warming probably this century. So if that's the case, then that's going to be really devastating for well, certainly for bumblebees, and many other examples too, but that's the one I know best.
Yeah, this is it's quite frightening to think of stepping out into a garden that doesn't have bumblebees flying around
and butterflies too, actually. I mean, there's been some interesting research on that, and the odd thing is that you might think actually lots of insects would benefit from it getting warmer, because there are more insects in warmer climates. If you go to France, they have more insects than we do here, largely because it's warmer. So you think, well, if it gets warmer, that'd be great. The insects will love it. And some insects will benefit from a warming climate and will shift their ranges accordingly. And we'll probably get a few new species colonizing from further south in Europe. But the data from butterflies shows that even though most butterflies love warm weather, climate change is having a negative impact because they're not able to shift their ranges. Something I touched on a minute ago, that the habitat isn't there. So although there might be somewhere suitable they could live further north, they've got to find it, and they've got to fly across motorways, fields full of crops sprayed with insecticides, a pretty hostile landscape to find little patches of habitat that they might occupy further north, and most of them just can't do that. So in fact all they end up doing is dying out in situ.
So it's this compound effect that you were talking about right at the beginning of all the layers of pressure that we've been putting on these populations all kind of coming together, and it actually doesn't really matter when you put it like that how well we maintain individual habitats, because if they are isolated, then it doesn't matter how good they are if climate change ends up pushing the insects out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really sad thing, isn't it? You can have a nature reserve which is beautifully protected and preserved, and but if the climate changes, then many of the creatures that live there won't be able to live there in the future. And that's obviously it's a tricky one, because climate change is such a thorny problem to address, and it feels a bit like your individual actions are futile in the face of this, global event. But actually, they're not. We can all do stuff to help.
And we will come back to that in the second half of the podcast. Now, one thing that Richard and I discuss quite a lot in our podcast is the issue of biodiversity. Now, we're trying to sort of illustrate the fact that a biodiverse garden is a healthy garden, and is a garden that's able to cope with pests and is more resilient to change as well. So we're trying to encourage people to encourage biodiversity in their gardens. But of course, climate change is one of those things that's going to affect biodiversity in gardens. But it's not just in gardens. Obviously, the garden is the only part that we actually have dominion over and we can affect. But there is a huge problem with global biodiversity, and it comes down to this resilience thing. And so what actually happens when you lose that biodiversity? Global sort of ecosystems and biomes start to degrade. And can you tell us a little bit about that in your words, because you're far better at this than I am, but just trying to impress upon people the importance that biodiversity is not just about not seeing those butterflies and their grandchildren not being able to see those nice beetles and things like that. It's actually about global resilience.
Yeah, I mean, we all depend upon biodiversity. We might not see it, or it may not be obvious if you live in a city and your food all sort of magically appears in the supermarket shelves. But actually, that food requires a healthy environment to produce it in the first place. It requires healthy soils, it requires pollinators, it requires natural enemies of crop pests and so on. So, and of course, many of the creatures doing this are insects, but other organisms are important too. We are part of nature, and we need to remember that. It might not seem like we are, but we can't survive without healthy ecosystems. There's this really interesting, I think, quite clever analogy by a guy called Paul Ehrlich, who's an American biologist, tries to explain, the role of species in ecosystems. And actually, we often don't know the role of species. There are so many, and their interactions are so complicated. We're just scratching the surface as scientists, trying to understand how ecosystems function. But his analogy was to losing species was, imagine an aeroplane which is held together with little rivets in the wings and the fuselage and everything. And he says, imagine what would happen if you one morning you went out and you pulled a few rivets out of the plane at random and then tried to fly it. Well, it would probably be okay. And then the next day you pull a few more rivets out of the plane and you try to fly it, and it'd probably be okay. But you keep doing it, and at some point a wing is going to fall off and the thing is going to crash. It's not a sensible thing to be doing.
Definitely not okay.
Definitely not okay. And nobody can predict the point at which the wing will fall off, because it's beyond us. But in exactly the same way, we're losing species right now from our ecosystems. We know that at some point it will reach a kind of critical tipping point where there just aren't enough species for the ecosystem to function anymore, and it will collapse. And so it's pretty obvious we need to stop that process as quickly as possible if we want a healthy future for our children.
Absolutely.
So it really is time to act, I guess.
Yeah. So on that, one of the nicest things about your books, and a common theme throughout your books, is that you provide us with actionable lists of things that we can do right now, some things that might take slightly longer, and some things that are really quick and easy to do, just go out and do. And they're almost a roadmap of things that we can do as individuals to make a difference. And as gardeners, and as people who have small patches of land to take care of, or as allotment holders similarly, there are quite a lot of things that we can do to help climate change and also to help biodiversity. So can you talk us through a couple of those things? It's the most important.
Yeah. Oh, well, so this is a can of worms, because there's so many things to talk about. I'll try and divide it up, and please stop me if I go on too long.
No, you
go. Gardens can support an incredible amount of diversity. Thousands of species can live in an allotment or a small garden, and that isn't an exaggeration. There's this lovely example from Leicester, the lady called Jenny Owen, who she wrote a book, The Wildlife of a Garden, based on 35 years of her identifying everything she could find in her garden. And her species list was, I think if I remember, it's 2,673 different species of animals and plants in an eighth of an acre garden in the middle of Leicester. Amazing. And it doesn't, you don't have to do anything particularly special to encourage wildlife. I mean, it's very simple, really. You don't use any pesticides, number one. Grow the right kinds of flowers, ones that produce nectar and pollen that pollinators love, and native wildflowers. Be a bit more tolerant of weeds. Don't mow too often. Have a little pond, maybe a bee hotel. All really simple stuff. Just generally be a bit more relaxed in your garden. Don't tidy, don't deadhead more than you have to, that kind of thing. And a combination of those simple actions in no time at all will result in a garden that's teeming with life and is more resilient to climate change than it would be. The more species you have, the better able it is to cope with these kind of big perturbations from outside, like a changing climate. So that's kind of a focus on biodiversity. But then addressing climate change directly, there's loads that gardeners can do and should stop doing as well, to combat climate change. So firstly, we should all think about what we buy as gardeners, and number one here is don't buy peat-based composts. I find it hard to believe and incredibly frustrating that we're still talking about this, because campaigns to stop peat extraction have been going on since I was a kid, 40 years at least, and we still haven't stopped. It's bonkers. Yeah. Basically peat is this massive store of carbon. It's kind of like a fossil fuel, essentially. And it's also, peatlands are rare habitats, and yet we're ripping this peat out of the ground, destroying a rare habitat, and as soon as it comes out of the bog, which is waterlogged and has no oxygen, the peat starts to oxidize, turning to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's directly contributing to climate change. And there are perfectly good alternatives. So please, please, please don't buy compost with peat in it. And ideally, don't buy plants that have been grown in peat.
And if you want to have a little bit more information on peat and why it is so important, do check out our episode about peat-free April. And we talked a lot about some of the other benefits of peat as its natural services.
Excellent. So we got that one covered. I mean, of course, there are other things not to buy. Try to avoid, plastic pots that are disposable, and don't buy fertilizers and pesticides. Fertilizers in particular actually are really bad for climate because their manufacture of synthetic fertilizers uses fossil fuels, and when you apply them to your garden, they release nitric and nitrous oxides, which are really potent greenhouse gases. So please do avoid using synthetic fertilizers in your garden. But then to the positive things you can do. So you can capture carbon in your garden. You can be involved directly yourself in combating climate change. And there's two ways really or two areas to think about. One is the soil, and the other is above ground kind of biomass. So above ground is easy to explain. And basically, the more plant material you have in your garden, the more carbon is locked up because it's not in the atmosphere. So having lots of trees and shrubs and long grass on your lawn, all of it contributes to sucking carbon out of the air and locking it up in plant material, which is great. So if you've got room, squeeze in a tree or two, leave your grass to grow, because the longer the grass is, the more carbon it's locking up in the leaves and in the roots below ground. That all helps, but probably the biggest thing you can do to combat climate change is to try and lock up carbon in your soil, because soils can be this amazing store of carbon, and that just comes down to getting as much organic matter onto your ground as you can. So compost, as long as it's not peat. Yeah, no, exactly. So composting all your green waste, all your kitchen scraps in a compost heap, mulching your vegetables, your flower beds, wherever you can, as much mulch as possible. Try to avoid digging too much because that damages the soil structure and tends to release carbon dioxide. And try and...
We talk a lot about no-dig gardening in this podcast and about trying to build up soil health, because I'm a huge soil geek. So
yeah, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? For people didn't used to really seem to think about soil. I mean, it is the most fantastic resource. It's arguably the most important thing we have on our planet is soil, because without soil, we're doomed. And there's some really scary statistics about how globally we've damaged soils.
Yeah.
But as a gardener, it's incumbent on you to look after the soil in your garden and make sure that it's as healthy as possible. And if everyone did that, wouldn't that be brilliant? And that would really make a difference.
It's very difficult to get people enthusiastic about soil. I mean, it's quite different to bumblebees. Bumblebees are very cute, whereas soil's just this sort of brown, inert looking thing.
Yeah, I know. People think dirt and mud, and it doesn't. It's not glamorous, I think it's safe to say.
But I think gardeners obsess over soil, and I think if they just knew a little bit more about soil and we didn't look at it from its sort of mineral components, we looked at it from a organic, ecological point of view, I think it would be even more fascinating for most people, hopefully.
Yeah, it is amazing. Unfortunately, it's sort of on a scale that we can't appreciate. But there are billions of organisms, literally billions in a teaspoon of soil. And again, I talked earlier about how little we understand about how ecosystems work. Actually, when it comes to soil, we're really, incredibly ignorant of what all these little organisms are doing. But it is very complicated and
all the little tiny rivets.
Yeah, exactly. So we should be gentle with our soil and look after it.
Absolutely. So we're going to focus on building up organic matter in our gardens, because organic matter is basically carbon, isn't it? And so we can create our own little carbon sinks, or we can do big carbon sinks if we're really keen. So we're going to be mulching, composting, making sure that we've got lots and lots of things growing in our gardens. and making sure that we're trying not to disturb our soil as much as possible. What else can we be doing?
I'm actually, I think I've run through most things. I mean, basically, make your garden as wildlife friendly as possible. Look after your soil, grow as many native plants as you can, and you've done it. You know, it's really, there's no magic to wildlife gardening. And I mean, you know, also I guess something to think about is if you grow your own food, you're minimizing your impact on the planet because you're buying less food. And a vegetable patch and a fruit patch, you know, to me is should be part of every garden. It's part of what a garden is for. It provides a home for wildlife. It can store carbon. It can support biodiversity, and it can feed people. You know, I mean, what more could you want than something that provides all of those amazing benefits? And you know, it's actually really easy to grow fruits and vegetables. I think many people are a bit daunted by the idea of, you know, starting to grow stuff, but actually, you know, there's no magic to it really. Well, it is kind of magical, but nothing.
The magic doesn't come from us.
You know, planting. It surprises me that we don't do more in schools to teach kids about, you know, simple things like how to grow and look after and harvest crops. It's such a basic skill that you'd think all human beings ought to know how to do that, but actually it's not something that's really covered in schools. And likewise, they don't, to my mind, cover anywhere near enough about you know, the importance of nature and understanding nature and what it does.
Absolutely.
And I'd love it if there were more right the way through schools, connecting, you know, giving kids a chance to get out into green spaces and watch bumblebees and butterflies and listen to bird song and just generally, you know,
get their fingers dirty.
Yeah.
We
do, because we're a sort of increasingly urban species. I think I saw a statistic: 80% of British people live in a city these days. There is a real danger that we're sort of losing our connection, but urban green spaces can provide that chance to reconnect, you know. So.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier, I think it was before we started recording, was this thing of when you were a child, and also when I was a child, we were outside with jars collecting things like cinnabar moth caterpillars and stuff and watching them grow. And nowadays, I mean, I've got 2 young children and they live in a city and they just don't really do those sorts of things. And you don't walk into children's bedrooms nowadays and find caterpillars chomping on bits of nettle and stuff like you did back in the 80s when I was a child. And yeah, it's just really sad that we seem to have this disconnect, because then the disconnect follows on through into adulthood. And you know, most people spent their childhood when at sort of my age and older, spent their childhood collecting beetles, but then lost that passion as grown-ups. But if they never had it in the first place, we've got even more of a disconnect, which is really upsetting.
Yeah, it does worry me. I mean, teaching at university, you know, we have students studying a degree in ecology and conservation, so they're obviously ones that are much more interested than average in nature. But I usually take we're assigned advisees at the beginning of each year, these new students, and I always take them out for a walk on campus and quiz them, you know, about their knowledge of nature, ask them if they can identify trees and common birds and so on. And many of them really struggle, you know, they don't know the difference between a jackdaw and a blackbird. They struggle to identify a sycamore tree, an oak tree. Even a blue tip is beyond some of them. And you think, crikey, you know, what are we doing as a society that our children... It relates as a really interesting book, The Forgotten Words by Robert Macfarlane, where which is inspired by the fact that the Oxford Junior Oxford English Dictionary started taking nature words out to make room for tech words and, you know, new words. And things like otter and acorn and kingfisher and even cauliflower is no longer in the dictionary, which I mean, my jaw dropped when I thought, well, surely cauliflower is a basic vegetable that people eat all the time, isn't it? But apparently it's not necessary for kids to have that in their vocabulary.
It's not even worth that small centimetre that it would take to explain.
I did find that really worrying. So yeah, there is a danger that, you know, we're increasingly disconnected from nature, and if people don't know about something, they're not going to care if it's threatened. So we do need to combat that. But I think gardens are a great place to do that. You know, a green space, even in the heart of a city, can be full of life and grow food and be a fantastic place for children to go and reconnect.
And what you were just saying about Rob McFarlane's book, I think you were going to say that he says that when you give something a name, that you instantly connect it and you can recognise it.
Yeah, it's an interesting... I'd never thought about this until I read his book. But, you know, he describes a name as almost like a sort of incantation or a spell or something that brings something to life. And I think it's true, you know, if you don't know what a brimstone butterfly is, then if it flies past you, you just ignore it. It's as if it wasn't there at all. Yeah. Whereas for me, when I see a brimstone, this time of year, they're just coming out of hibernation. There's beautiful yellow butterflies. Sometimes I see flying across my study window, just behind where my laptop is right now. And it's just magic, you know, because they're beautiful and it's a sign of spring. And it's just, you know, I can't imagine not knowing what that is and not appreciating it. But sadly, many people don't.
I think the same is true for gardeners and recognising plants as well, because we have this tendency, if we don't understand, if we don't observe and recognise plants, we have plant blindness, it's called. And whereas when you start gardening and you plant something in your garden and you remember its name and then you see it elsewhere, and it's exactly the same for bees and butterflies and birds and things like that. If you recognise it, then you can connect it and it becomes more important to you. So it's really important to start those dots joining up when children are little and make sure that they're starting to understand so that they care when they're older.
Yeah, absolutely. You remind me actually that I've seen on social media there's a really interesting movement, people identifying plants growing in cracks in pavements in city streets and using chalk to write the name of the plant next to them, so that people walking by can see, you know, this isn't just a weed, whatever, you know, a weed is, but actually it's a particular plant species. You know, it might be a shepherd's purse or whatever it might be. There's all sorts of plant diversity right under our feet on the pavements that, again, we walk over and totally ignore. But actually, if someone puts a name to it, you suddenly sort of draws attention to it in a new way. I think that's really cool.
So the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is, I'm going to call it that chapter in Silent Earth. You probably already know the one that I'm referring to, but it's the look back from the future. Now, I've read this one about 4 or 5 times now. And just for anybody who hasn't read the book yet, it's basically a look back. I think it's from the 2080s, doing the sort of rough maths. And it's the point of view of your son. And he's sort of telling us what's happened over the last 60 years to the planet. And he's also remarking how grateful he is to have a vegetable patch. And I think it's quite dark, but it's necessarily dark because it's a bit of a wake-up call, really. And the first time I read it, I sort of had to sit in silence for a few minutes and just check in with myself and make sure I was okay. But if you haven't read it yet, it's really, really worth reading. But Dave, can you just tell us a little bit about this? Because it's probably one of the better informed look backs from the future. It's certainly more informed than the robots have taken over the world kind of point of view. And maybe scarier.
Yeah, so I nearly didn't include this chapter. My agent suggested I take it out, but I thought I wanted to keep it because it tries to bring it all together. You know, the book talks about all these different problems that the environment faces from an insect perspective, but they're really all general issues: climate change and habitat loss and pollution and pesticides and everything. And people tend to see them in isolation rather than trying to understand the combined effect of all of them on our lives and on the planet into the future. So I tried to imagine. My eldest son was born in 2001, so I tried to put myself in his shoes when he's aged 80, looking back at his life. And I suppose it's maybe not a worst case scenario, but it's my best guess as to what will happen in the next 60 years if we don't really pull our fingers out and address these big issues that we all know about, that scientists have been warning politicians about for decades, but which so far they've failed to act on. And if they continue to fail, then it's going to be tough in the future. I mean, it's, you know, I sometimes feel like that crazy person, you know, with a placard, "The end is nigh," you know, the apocalypse is coming or something. And it's a kind of a cartoon crazy character, but actually I feel that maybe that not the end is nigh, but that life is going to be really tough for future generations if we don't watch out. You know, arguably, people of roughly our age, I know I'm older than you are, but people born in the 20th century may well have had the best of it, you know, because we've got used to lives getting better. For our children can expect to live longer, to have a better standard of living than we had. And that's been the case for hundreds of years now, since the Industrial Revolution, really. But I think we may have peaked because, you know, we are basically depleting our planet's resources. We are damaging the soil, we're altering the climate, we're wiping out biodiversity that we depend upon. And if we continue to do all of those things, then future generations are going to really struggle. And I think society as we know it may start to crumble. So I'm imagining basically a kind of dystopian future where essentially it's kind of survival of the fittest, and it's back to growing as much food as you can on your little patch. And so my son is sitting up all night guarding the vegetable patch against someone coming and stealing the fruit and veg, because, you know, their lives depend upon what they can grow. I hope it never comes to that. I really do. But
so do I. But it's a good argument for teaching a kid to grow food, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I think any responsible parent should make sure that their kids are equipped to deal with that future as best they can if it comes. I mean, I really, really hope we do better than that. And I do find it bizarre that, you know, that so few people are really engaged with these environmental subjects at the moment. They don't really think it's important to them. And yet, you know, they would do anything for their children, apart from leave them a decent planet to live on. You know, it's nuts when you stop to think about it.
Yeah, just got to wonder where the tipping point is, really, when people decide that enough is enough. But at the moment, the tipping point is nowhere in sight.
No, indeed, and I find it very frustrating. You know, I sort of pretty much spend my life trying to communicate with the world, to convince as many people as possible to act, you know, to do things like make their gardens more wildlife friendly, capture carbon where they can, reduce their footprint, and all the rest of it. But most people aren't listening, you know, and you'll, I'm sure the same. The people that listen to your podcasts, you know, they're probably already the ones that agree with you. How do we win over the people that aren't listening? That's the real challenge. They're out there. There's millions of them, but I don't know how to get to them.
Well, a really good way is by growing fantastic vegetables in really organic, rich, no-dig gardens and allotments, and then all your allotment neighbours start peering over the fence and wondering what it is that you're doing right, and then gradually you find this spread through the allotment sites or through the gardens, and it does spread gradually, but it is only gradually. I think we need to be starting to have conversations with people on a really, really wide scale, just as individuals. Bring it up at the dinner table. If you're going out with friends, bring it up.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think if everyone won over one person and they all won over one person, in no time at all, we'd have We'd have everybody on board. Yeah, we have to do it somehow, but it does feel frustratingly slow sometimes.
I agree. Well, Dave, it's been such a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for taking your time to come and talk to us. We really, really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. It's been fun.
Cool. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
So I really hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation. Dave really is so passionate and inspiring. I really recommend that you check out his books. The Garden Jungle is one of his books that is an absolute celebration of all the fantastic life that we have in our gardens. So if you haven't read any of his books yet, that's a really, really good place to start. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.